Hello, and welcome to this screencast on the making of industrial society. Oh, there I am. So, this is a chapter in Bentley and Ziegler's Traditions and Encounters, 5th edition, chapter 29, that focuses on one key concept. Although that key concept is the most important one, perhaps in this time period, at least it's listed as number one by the College Board in the AP World History class, and that is industrial capitalism and the global economy. Now, as the second part of that makes clear, this will have effect on all the other things. So it's the chapter is more focused in that way than some others. Additionally, the Industrial Revolution, as that term is understood in a lot of history classes, began in Britain and then spread through Western Europe and the United States, and then a few other places around the world, kind of Egypt, Russia, Japan, and others. As a result, this chapter is also fairly tightly focused on the European experience to understand industrial society. There are certainly parallels from the European experience that can be drawn as societies were affected in other parts of the world. But of course, there's always multiple variables, and history is contingent, meaning that developments in history have been influenced by multiple things. So we can apply some of these lessons outside of Europe, but you should be aware that this is primarily about European history. In fact, several of the images in here are images that are either from the chapter or from things I've done on European history. Let's go ahead and take a look. I would also say, as we take a look at this initial subpoint, is that industrialization is a topic that many students come into a world history class already having some exposure to in their middle school classes or previous social studies classes, whether that be US history and or geography. With that said, when we look at this in a world history perspective as opposed to an American perspective, industrialization began sooner, and it also includes two different phases as people think about it. And a lot of times, what students bring into class is an understanding of what we would call the second, or what historians would call the second industrial revolution. So just kind of keep that in mind. That's a way to take, for a student, to take what you already know, try to broaden it out in this process. Okay. Now, so oftentimes textbooks will start by looking at why did the industrialization start in Britain? And this is a really interesting point to look at because a lot of the key technological prerequisites for industrialization had been present in China, as one prominent example, for centuries before they were prominent in Britain. So, using the carbon from coal turned into coke, which is coal that is mostly carbon. That had been happening in China for a long time, a few 500 years maybe, before it started happening in Britain in a wide scale. So the primary difference between Britain and some other places around the world was not so much technological as it was social, economic, political. So in this case, capitalism, we have to understand that capital was fundamental to the building of industrialization because there had to be a lot of investment and much in factories and machines that produced industrialization. And much of that investment came from British colonies, the profits from the trade in enslaved people, from human trafficking, and the profits from sugar plantation. In some cases, sugar plantations, excuse me, in some cases were directly invested in early factories, or in other cases, indirectly through banks and other capital markets like stock exchanges. So we have that. Britain did have plenty of coal. So just saying that Britain had a lot of coal and knew how to use it, that's not sufficient to understand early industrialization, but it was necessary for the early industrial processes that happened. So if you think of capital, and some of that was British banks, colonies for profits to kind of go into those banks, and coal reserves are three of the main reasons why the Industrial Revolution began in Britain back. Britain also had a slightly better transportation network than other places in Europe. So that would be roads and canals that had been building for a while. There was more of a market economy there than in some other places. Now, again, when textbooks are making this kind of point, it's really borrowing from European history, because what they're doing is they're comparing Britain to other places in Europe. As I mentioned, one key area of distinction. There's the coal. I'm going to go back over here. One key area of distinction is between the first industrial revolution. You can see the dates there, which was focused on these three items. Now, textiles is an important vocabulary word for world history. It's the answer to more questions, perhaps, than any other trade good, because it's so important across time. Textiles refers to the process of making cloth and cloth itself. Okay? So the textiles is the cloth industry, which is mostly spinning. I'm doing this, spinning together the fibers to make them strong, and then weaving, taking threads and weaving them together. Okay. Combine these things here, we get railroads. That's more transportation, so now it's trying to feed back on itself. The second industrial revolution is kicked off with a breakthrough in the mass production of steel called the Bessemer process. And that contributes to other industries. And there's also a lot of technological discoveries in the chemical dyes, the harnessing of electricity, use of other kinds of fossil fuels. So all of that. So really the main thing to have here is to think that the Industrial Revolution may begin sooner than some students think, and it happens in two different stages, and we should kind of, keep those somewhat separate, or just understand the distinctions. Be one of the final stages. So what are we talking about then? So the change in how goods were produced and consumed involves investment. So that's capitalism. So investments in machines that are using inanimate power sources. So what that means is not the water. Well, I guess that's somewhat inanimate too, but it's not an animal, but not animal or human power. But then ultimately mineral power. So like coal, later oil, gasoline, today natural gas, which will make location of factories more flexible. Industrial capitalism also has the effect of controlling the workforce more, because workers are disciplined by the factory owners. It's because the workers don't control the means of production, they don't have much of a say over the schedule. So I'm going to pay attention to that, how that works. An effect of this then is going to be, of course, industrial scale production, which will have the effect of lowering prices and leading to more consumption. So will also be bad news for smaller producers. This is something we're still working through today, really. How large industrial, and businesses make things more difficult for smaller producers and businesses, and what's the balance there between providing cheap products for the public and providing kind of equal opportunities for people to form businesses and accumulate wealth. You can think of this a little bit as like the Walmart problem, right? Walmart drives smaller businesses out in small towns where it operates, but it also delivers lower prices for consumers in those communities. Okay. This is a global phenomenon. And so this will be the point in time where there's a shift in the balance of economic power from East and South Asia to Western Europe and then the United States, and then later Japan, as highly industrialized societies. So if you've been listening to these screencasts, or hopefully your teacher's been saying, if you don't, well, they have if you have me, and hopefully they have been even if you don't, that until we get to 1800, the center of the economic world is still in China in terms of the largest producer and consumer. And then India, South Asia, secondarily, but still very important. That's all the way up through 1800. This is the switch. After 1800, things rapidly became quite different in that way. So industrialized countries seek to change their relationship with the rest of the world. Instead of importing, consumer goods like tea or cotton cloth, they're looking to import materials to make things. This is over the course of the 1800s. This gets more and more true. So the British, additionally going to, let's say, West Africa and looking for gold, right? Traditional export thing, like something that's inherently valuable in and of itself. You can think of gold as sort of the basis for a consumer good. Or later trafficking in enslaved people, Later, they're going to be looking for palm oil to lubricate the wheels of machines, or rubber to be used in factories. Okay. So then exporting finished goods. So that had been going on for a while. Like textile manufacturers in England and the Low Countries and northern Italy had been manufacturing textiles for the global markets for years, but there's a huge shift in the volume and percentage that's coming from European countries. Contrary to myth making, these places did benefit from government productions. In all societies that industrialized, their governments started by taxing imported goods to make industries in that country more viable. In Britain, this is called the Calico Acts, and it was continued. The United States did the same thing. Once countries get up and going and they have very efficient industries that can outcompete other places on price, all of a sudden they want other countries to allow their goods and without being taxed. This is the British game, right? It's kind of a con, right? They start out like, hey, we're going to put taxes on other stuff to protect our industries. Then when those industries become highly competitive, like they can produce the cloth for less, they're like, oh, no, it's free market time. You need to accept our stuff. The point being that the state plays a role in this. Then, right. So that's free market ideology is another way to try to force people to take imports from their companies. Okay. And that says destroyed many smaller businesses, especially in the colonies. That's going to be true thinking, especially of British India, where small producers of cotton cloth are eliminated and instead are kind of reduced often to growing cotton as a commodity with volatile prices on the world market. One way to look at this shift is by pausing and taking a good look at this graph. Now there's a couple things that are to know about this. The years don't go by uniformly. It's not a uniform scale, but you should kind of just keep track of what's happening to China, East Asia, and India, compared to the United Kingdom and Western Europe over time. And then it takes us all the way up to the present. You can see things changing again. All right. So if we take a look at this slide here, you can see that process of global spread that I talked about. And mainly it'll just be 1 and 2 in this chapter 29, with 3, 4, and 5 coming up in later chapters that focus on those parts of the world. I think actually those are all in chapter 31 in Traditions and Encounters, 5th edition. But it's worth noting that industrialization did become global. And what that means is that there are factory systems set up all over the place. And if you think of what we identify as the initial industrial capitalist product, it's textiles, and textiles and clothing is of course produced all over the world today. So keep a look at that. It's a silk factory in Japan at the right there. Okay, let me go get myself out of there. Okay, so that's sort of the basic international and political economy of it. And then you should also be paying attention to the social effects that industrialization has. Again, noting that some of these things will be the same in other countries, when the United States and Western Europe and Japan and Russia and Egypt. I had up there as examples, but there's many more. But in other cases, local factors will also become involved. So these are some generalizations that, to be clear, are based on the Western European experience. One of these will be new ideas as it relates to gender. Some of the things that we associate with gender ideology are things that arose during industrial times. So meaning the notion that men and women should ideally dominate different spheres or physical spaces of society, and that women's productive labor, like making things, is less valuable or not valuable, especially as compared to their reproductive labor, bearing and raising children. That's a modern idea in Britain and then in European and also Euro-American societies that comes out of industrialization. It comes from a middle class ideal where growing middle classes, which will be part of what we have here. Well, middle classes are in the next. They'll be in the next slide. But where families are actually smaller in size, even though population's growing. So this is one of the paradoxes. I'll come back to the gender roles in a minute. But what's happening is families have smaller. Families are having fewer babies, especially middle class families, because they see children as kind of as expensive. They need to be educated and raised and cared for. And a whole different set of ideas around what it means to parent children develops, meaning that families need to be investing in their children to be successful in the world once they become adults, as opposed to in traditional rural and working class families where children are economic assets working, whether that's in agriculture or perhaps in factory labor or workshop labor, kind of as soon as they can, like age 6, maybe even 6-year-old kids in the cottage industry are helping with things. They're still treated as children, the evidence suggests, but it's a different kind of idea. Middle class families start to develop this idea that will be more familiar to us during the 1800s, which is that children are precious and should be invested in order to secure their future. This, along with the growth in middle class employment, where many men can earn enough salary in order to purchase all the family's needs on the market, allows women to sort of specialize in this child rearing. So, women's reproductive labor, again, which isn't just like childbirth, like actual labor, but is also refers to raising and nurturing children, that becomes highly valued, with the knock-on effect of kind of stigmatizing working class women who can't afford to do that, because working class women of course work. And then you should also note that many of these middle class women are doing very hard physical labor in terms of caring for their homes, before all the machines we use to clean and prepare food. This household labor is hard, sweaty work. And we shouldn't use, what I'm trying to caution students about, is taking a stereotype of 1950s white America and projecting that back into the past. For one thing, that's really, if you were to do that, it's going to look different, and it's going to start like in the 1840s. Okay. So these are where some of these ideas come from. Population continues to go up, though. Well, why is that? If births are going down, why is population going up? Well, because there is a decrease in the death rate due to vaccinations and sanitation. Medicine is still not real helpful yet. There's not much, there's no antibiotics. If you think of what might, save a person's life today. And so there's that. The microbiology is it's at the very end of this period, and then germ theory even develops. So what we have here, though, is what geography students will recognize as the demographic transition model. Okay. And as you're reading this, just note when they say fertility here, that refers to the birth rate, the number of births per, it's usually births per like 1,000 women, or it might births per a certain number of women between certain ages. So just look for that. Okay. It's the last thing here. We get new ideas about class and culture then. So one of the things that's happening is that industrial capitalism changes the social class structure. And this will happen anywhere that it goes on in the world. Of course, what will be different is, what did the existing class structure look like? There are going to be some similarities, where like rural elites, for instance, like nobility, that's going to be, have that like in East Asia and in Europe. Those groups now are going to face competition for, richness from the what, sometimes they're called the bourgeoisie, the factory owners, the capitalist class, the financiers. Now, of course, many of those noble families stay rich by investing in these new processes. So it's not like all of a sudden people who had been nobles, aren't that wealthy. You can think about it with royalty, like Queen Elizabeth II. Like, she's still loaded, right? a lot of spending money. Because her family's wealthy, and some of that's been invested. I'm sure at some point they start putting that stuff in stocks and things like that. So we have this group here, kind of at the top. This would be like your upper middle class. And then this new kind of middle class, if you will. These are people with office jobs. And this is often gendered. And so this would be where there's going to be opportunities for men that aren't available for women in these kinds of positions. the sort of lower middle class or upper working class, like clerical and secretarial jobs, eventually being something open to women, but in kind of a what you might call like pink collar positions or clear what we refer to as glass ceilings, where women don't rise up. They don't like get into like a upper management track. And finally, you should know that when we talk about wage laborers, that's different than just being poor. And a worker, someone who's working class in this context, that is different than being a peasant. Now, of course, there's similarities. Physical labor, lower social status. You know, probably lower levels of education, but there's very big differences. Some peasants during this time, especially in countries like France, owned their own property. They were property owners. So in some senses, they were like tiny capitalists, like regular sized people, but, small amounts of capital. So they're more like small business owners, like farmers. Well, farmers say are like medium or big business owners, but, what do we think of American farmers, say white farmers in the 1800s. So there's that. And peasants who didn't own their own land, that was their goal. Whereas wage laborers had like no hope of owning the means of production, like getting a hold of like a factory, say. So it's different. Also tend to be urban, less traditional because they're not in the traditional community, and they're getting paid wages, much like many students do today. If they have jobs, they get paid wages. We see that as normal, but there are really big differences that creates. Okay. So there's going to be new class conflicts that come from this. So the old class conflicts still continue to happen in societies that are partially industrializing, like in China and Russia. There's some big peasant revolts during this time. In countries that have shifted more to industrialization, those class conflicts happen between urbanized workers. You're going to see, you might have noticed this in chapter 28. They kind of move through it pretty quickly, but there's revolutions in the cities in the 1830s, well, even a little before, but especially in the 1830s and 1848 in all the big cities in Europe that are related to this like kind of growing urban working class that's precarious, meaning like a economic change can destroy their life like at any moment, and isn't connected into any kind of community. So you get these new sort of class conflicts. And that's going to lead to new ideologies like communism and socialism that are attractive to those people. But that's somewhat of a different topic. So I'm going to close here and wish you all luck and enjoyment reading chapter 29. All right. Thank you.